That's the first thing I remember from my wedding day. Not the lace veil that trailed behind me like a ghostly shadow. Not the heavy scent of white roses crowding the altar. Not even the shimmer of champagne light spilling across the marble floors. Just the hollow press of Matteo Romano's lips against mine. And the cold realization that I had just vowed my life to a man who couldn't love me back. The world watched with envy that night. They saw power, elegance, and destiny. They saw the daughter of the De Luca family, marrying the most feared man in New York's underworld. What they didn't see, what they could never see, was the chain tightening around my heart, link by gilded link, as the priest's words blurred into a hum I barely heard. Matteo's eyes, a glacial gray that seemed carved from smoke and storm, didn't flicker with emotion when he looked at me. They assessed me, like a transaction completed, a signature sealed. I wanted to hate him for that. I wanted to tear the veil from my head and run until the hem of my dress turned to ash behind me. But my father's eyes were on me, proud, weary, and desperate. The alliance meant survival. The Romano name meant protection. And I was the price. When Matteo's hand closed over mine, it was steady, unyielding, and cold enough to steal the air from my lungs. His touch wasn't cruel. It wasn't gentle either. It was inevitable. Like fate. Like the tightening of a noose. His voice, low and calm as the ocean before a storm, murmured, "You'll play the role of my wife, nothing more." I smiled for the cameras, smiled for the guests who toasted to our future, smiled for my father whose enemies now dared not breathe in our direction. But inside, I felt a quiet, dying thing unfurl in my chest, something small and foolish that had once believed in love. The reception was a blur of glitter and lies. Champagne glasses clinked. The band played a melody I barely heard. Matteo stood beside me, perfectly polite, perfectly distant, a man sculpted from marble and menace. Every woman in the room looked at him the way they used to look at fairy tales, unaware that the prince in this story carried a gun under his jacket and blood on his hands. I tried to memorize his face, the sharp angles of his jaw, the cruel beauty of his mouth, the way his shoulders carried the weight of kingdoms and corpses alike. He didn't look at me. Not once. He looked at the crowd, at his men, at the exits, always calculating, always in control. It wasn't until we danced, the first and only time that night, that I felt the first crack in his armor. His hand rested lightly on the small of my back, guiding me in rhythm, though his movements were practiced, mechanical. The air between us was thick with the scent of cedar and smoke, the faint trace of whiskey on his breath. "Relax," he murmured, his voice so close to my ear that it trembled through me. "Everyone's watching." "I can't. I whispered back, hating the way my voice shook. He didn't answer. His grip tightened just slightly, enough to keep me upright when my knees threatened to give out. To anyone watching, we looked like a perfect couple. Beauty and power united, a story written in gold. But underneath, I felt the tension humming through him like a live wire. It wasn't attraction. It was restraint. And then, just as the final notes of the song faded, the night shattered. A sharp crack split the air, gunfire, unmistakable even through the music and laughter. The guests screamed. Glass broke. The lights flickered. Matteo's body moved before my mind could even process what was happening. One moment I was staring at the spinning chandelier above us. The next I was crushed beneath his weight. My face pressed against his chest as chaos erupted around us. "Stay down," he hissed, voice rough, low and furious. The scent of his cologne mixed with gunpowder. His arm was locked around me, shielding me from sight as his men fanned out. I could hear them shouting orders, feel the vibrations of boots and bullets and fear trembling through the marble. My heart slammed against my ribs, a terrified bird trying to escape. And Matteo, Matteo didn't flinch. Even with danger burning around us, his breathing stayed steady. His eyes, when I finally dared to look up, were pure steel, focused, deadly. I realized then that he wasn't afraid because he lived in this world. Violence was his native language. When the gunfire stopped, when silence returned like the aftermath of a storm, Matteo straightened and helped me to my feet. My hands were trembling. His weren't. He scanned the room with a predator's calm, assessing damage, issuing quiet commands. "Was anyone hit?" he asked one of his men. "No, boss. Just a warning shot from outside. They missed." He nodded once, then turned to me. His expression softened by a fraction, so slight I might have imagined it. "You're safe now." I wanted to ask who they were, who would dare to send a bullet through a wedding filled with mafia heads and bodyguards. I wanted to ask if this was how my life would be from now on. Blood instead of roses, whispers instead of vows. But I couldn't speak. My throat was tight, my heart too loud. He guided me away from the shattered glass, his hand firm on the small of my back. When we reached the hallway, away from the noise and panic, he finally stopped and looked at me. For a heartbeat, there was something human in his gaze. Guilt, maybe, or the faintest flicker of regret. "This is what you married into," he said quietly, almost to himself. "Now you understand." And I did. God help me, I did. I understood that I was no longer a daughter, no longer a woman with choices, no longer anyone except Mrs. Matteo Romano, wife to a man whose heart was buried with the woman he lost, whose soul was wrapped in shadow. He left me alone in the hallway, the sound of his footsteps echoing like the toll of a warning bell. I leaned against the wall, shaking, trying to breathe. The taste of fear lingered on my tongue, metallic and sharp. Somewhere deep inside me, something whispered that I should have run when I had the chance. But when I looked at the blood-stained floor and thought of the way he had thrown himself in front of me without hesitation, another thought crept in. Quieter and far more dangerous. What if the man who couldn't love was the only one capable of saving me? As the last of the guests were ushered out and the night's chaos faded into silence, I caught a glimpse of him through the open door. Matteo, standing beneath the shattered chandelier, staring up at the light as if he could will it to stop trembling. That was the moment I realized two things. First, that my life would never again belong to me. And second, that no matter how cold his heart seemed now, someday, something would break it open. I just didn't know yet what it would cost to make that happen. The morning after the wedding felt like waking in someone else's dream, one made of silk sheets and shadows, where sunlight tried to spill through heavy curtains but failed, where the air was too still, too perfect, as though the house itself had been built to suffocate noise, warmth, or the smallest trace of rebellion. I woke alone, still in a haze of perfume and exhaustion, my wedding dress discarded on the chair like a dead promise, the faint scent of gunpowder lingering beneath the sweetness of roses. For a moment, I almost believed the night before had been a fever dream. The vows, the gunfire, Matteo's hand gripping mine with quiet authority. But then I saw the thin gold band on my finger, glinting like a brand, and reality settled over me like frost. The Romano estate was unlike anything I had ever known. A fortress disguised as a palace, elegant on the surface but humming with menace underneath. The walls were made of stone and secrets, the halls filled with the soft echo of footsteps that never seemed to belong to anyone you could see. Every corner had eyes, every shadow felt alive, and even the air seemed to whisper that this was no home. This was a cage made beautiful enough to trick you into forgetting it had locks. When I finally left the bedroom, a woman in black greeted me with a small bow and eyes that gave nothing away. "Mrs. Romano," she said softly, the title sounding foreign and wrong, as if it belonged to someone else entirely. Mr. Romano asked me to show you to breakfast. I wanted to tell her that I wasn't hungry, that food couldn't possibly touch the hollow ache curling in my stomach, but I nodded instead, following her through a maze of corridors that smelled faintly of lemon polish and old money. The dining room was vast, too vast for one man, with a table long enough to seat 20, though only one place was set besides mine. Matteo was already there, sitting at the head of the table, reading something on his phone with the same intensity I imagined he used to plan wars. His dark hair was perfectly in place, his white shirt crisp, sleeves rolled to his forearms, revealing the faint scars that crossed his skin, evidence of a life written in violence and duty. When he looked up, his expression didn't change, but I felt his attention like the sudden flick of a spotlight. "You're awake," he said, his tone flat, almost indifferent. I hesitated, unsure of how to answer such a simple statement when the air between us was filled with everything we weren't saying. "Yes," I managed finally, my voice smaller than I wanted it to be. He gestured to the seat beside him. "Eat." It wasn't a request. I sat, hands clasped in my lap, watching him cut into his food with quiet precision. The silence stretched, heavy and uncomfortable, until I thought it might crush me entirely. I tried to find something, anything to say, something that might pierce that wall of calm he wore like armor. "About last night," I began carefully. "The shooting." His eyes flicked up, and that was all it took for the words to die in my throat. "Handled," he said, as though that single word was enough to erase the chaos, the blood, the terror that still echoed in my memory. "Handled," I repeated, almost laughing, though it came out sounding more like disbelief than humor. "People tried to kill us at our wedding, Matteo. I think that deserves more than one word." He set his fork down with deliberate slowness, leaned back in his chair, and studied me in silence. The weight of his gaze was almost unbearable, cold, assessing, faintly irritated. But beneath that, something flickered, something wounded and hidden that I couldn't quite name. "You married into this world," he said finally, his voice quiet but sharp enough to cut. "You don't get to be shocked by it now." "I didn't marry into it by choice," I shot back before I could stop myself. His expression didn't change, but his jaw tightened slightly, a pulse flickering there. "Choice," he murmured, as if tasting the word and finding it foreign. "No one in this life has it, Isabella, not even me." The sound of my name on his lips startled me more than his words. He hadn't said it before. Not once. It sounded strange coming from him. Rougher, heavier, as if he wasn't used to saying something so personal. We fell into silence again. But it was different now. Not empty, but electric. Charged with something that neither of us wanted to name. I watched him as he finished his coffee, the way his hands moved. Deliberate, graceful, yet every motion held restrained power, like he was built from control itself. After breakfast, he stood and buttoned his jacket. "You'll stay inside today," he said without looking at me. "I have business in the city." "Business?" I repeated softly, knowing exactly what that meant. Deals, threats, maybe blood. He didn't deny it. He only glanced at me once, and in that look, I saw something fleeting. Hesitation, perhaps even apology, before it vanished behind the familiar mask. "I'll have someone show you the house," he said. "You'll find ways to keep yourself occupied." I almost asked him if that meant I was allowed to leave, to breathe air that wasn't soaked in the scent of his world, but the words stuck in my throat. Because deep down, I already knew the answer. When he left, the silence of the mansion grew louder, pressing in on me from every direction. I wandered through the rooms, vast, beautiful, lifeless spaces, the kind that seemed built to impress outsiders but not to be lived in. The library was the only room that felt remotely human. It smelled of old books and whiskey, the air heavy with quiet history. That was when I saw it. A framed photograph on the mantel. A woman with dark hair and a smile that seemed to belong to another lifetime. Matteo was beside her, younger, softer somehow, his arm wrapped around her waist, his eyes unguarded in a way I couldn't imagine now. A chill rippled through me. I didn't need to ask who she was. I had heard whispers before the wedding, that Matteo Romano had once been in love, that she had died because of a war between families, that her death had turned him into the cold, ruthless king he was now. Seeing her face made it real, and something inside me twisted painfully. Jealousy, sorrow, compassion, all tangled together in a way that made no sense. Later that night, when he returned, I was waiting in the library. He paused at the doorway, his expression unreadable. "You shouldn't be in here," he said quietly. "Why? Because of her?" I asked, nodding toward the photograph. He didn't answer. His silence said everything. "I'm not her," I whispered. "I don't want to be her. But I also can't be nothing to you." He looked at me for a long time, his eyes dark and tired. "You don't understand," he said, voice rough around the edges. "You shouldn't want anything from me, Isabella. It will destroy you." He turned to leave, but before he stepped out, he paused, his hand resting on the doorframe. "Go to sleep. Tomorrow you'll learn what it really means to be my wife." And then he was gone, leaving me with the ghost of his warning echoing in the darkness. A promise or a threat, I couldn't tell. But I knew one thing with terrible certainty. Whatever waited for me in the days ahead would break something in me, or awaken something far worse. There are moments when silence becomes its own kind of violence, when it cuts deeper than words ever could, when it wraps around your throat like invisible hands, tightening just enough to remind you who holds the power. That was what it felt like in the Romano mansion after that night. A house full of people, and yet so hollow that even my footsteps dared not make a sound. The next morning, I woke to find a dress laid out for me, elegant but modest, a pale ivory silk that whispered wealth and restraint. Beside it was a note written in Matteo's precise, almost mechanical handwriting. "Breakfast at 9. Do not be late." There was no greeting, no signature, no warmth, just the command, cool and sharp, as though affection were a language he had forgotten, or perhaps never learned. I told myself I hated him for it. I told myself that every glance, every order, every dismissive silence only strengthened my resolve to remain untouched by him, to preserve some piece of myself that he couldn't control. But when I entered the dining room and found him there, sleeves rolled, tie loose, hair slightly disheveled as though he hadn't slept, something traitorous inside me faltered. He didn't look up right away, absorbed in papers spread across the table, the morning light catching the fine edge of his profile. His presence filled the room effortlessly, the kind of quiet dominance that didn't need to be announced. When he finally did raise his gaze to me, it was brief, unreadable, a flicker of gray steel that landed on my face before returning to the document in his hand. "Sit," he said softly without looking again, and I obeyed before I even thought about it. Breakfast passed in a strange, brittle calm, the only sounds the clink of cutlery and the rustle of papers. I wanted to ask where he'd gone the night before, wanted to demand to know what he meant by learning what it means to be my wife. But something in his posture warned me not to. He was a man made of boundaries, and to cross one without permission would be to step into a storm I wasn't yet strong enough to survive. After a while, he said, almost absently, "I'll be meeting with my men this afternoon. You'll stay upstairs." I frowned. "Why? What are you hiding from me?" His head tilted slightly, and his eyes lifted at last. Slow, deliberate, like the turning of a gun toward its target. "I don't hide," he said, voice calm but edged. I protect. There's a difference. Protect me from what? You said last night I'd learn what it means to be your wife. So tell me, Matteo, am I a partner or am I another possession to be locked away? His expression didn't change, but the faintest muscle in his jaw tightened. For a long moment he didn't answer, then finally said, You want to see what I am? Fine. But don't ask me to be gentle with the truth. He stood, and I followed, a mix of defiance and dread rising in my throat as he led me down the marble corridor and into the study. The room I'd seen only briefly before, filled with shelves of books and the faint scent of smoke and leather. He opened a door hidden behind one of the bookshelves, revealing a narrow stairwell that led downward into darkness. I hesitated at the threshold, my pulse quickening. Where does this lead? He didn't answer, only descended, the echo of his footsteps a low rhythm against the stone. I followed because I had no choice, or perhaps because I couldn't stop myself. At the bottom was another world entirely. A concrete basement lit by harsh fluorescent lights, the air heavy with gun oil, and the faint metallic tang of blood. Men stood around a long table scattered with maps, weapons, and stacks of cash. They straightened when Matteo entered, their deference immediate, instinctive. This was his kingdom, I realized. Not the ballroom, not the gilded halls, but this, the raw pulse of control and danger that kept everything else standing. One of the men, a tall, dark-haired lieutenant with a scar across his cheek, glanced at me, uncertain. Boss, she's with me, Matteo said curtly. I stood beside him, trying to hide the tremor in my hands as I watched him transform before my eyes. The calm, distant man I'd married disappeared, replaced by something sharper, colder, the predator behind the mask. His voice when he spoke was low, measured, deadly. The traitor was seen near the docks last night, one of the men said. We think he's been feeding information to the Caruso family. Matteo's gaze hardened. And you let him live? No, boss, we... He raised a hand, silencing the man instantly. Find him, he said, each word like a knife point. Find him and bring him to me, alive. There was no anger in his tone, no shouting, just quiet authority that made obedience an instinct. It chilled me, not because of the violence itself, but because of how natural it was for him, how easily he commanded it, as if cruelty had become a second skin. When the men left, he turned back to me. Now you understand why I said to stay upstairs? He murmured. This is what I am. I swallowed hard, unable to tear my gaze away from him. And what am I supposed to do with that? Accept it, he said simply. Something inside me broke at the calm certainty of his answer. Accept it? I echoed, my voice rising despite myself. Accept that my husband orders people's deaths over breakfast? That you treat murder like business? You expect me to live beside that and call it love? His eyes flashed then, not with anger exactly, but with something darker, a wounded pride, a shadow of something human. In 2 quick strides, he was in front of me, his hand closing around my wrist, not hard enough to hurt, but firm enough that I could feel the restrained power beneath his skin. Don't ever use that word with me, he said quietly, dangerously. You don't know what it means in my world. Then teach me, I whispered, breathless, trembling but refusing to look away. Because whether you like it or not, I'm in it now. For a heartbeat, something flickered in his eyes. Conflict, maybe even longing, before the walls came back up. He released me abruptly, turning away. You don't want to be taught, he said. You want to believe there's something left of me that can feel the way you do. There isn't. He walked toward the stairs, the tension in his shoulders a visible strain. I followed him back up, the silence between us thicker than before, filled with the ghosts of things neither of us dared to name. That night, long after the mansion had gone still, I found myself pacing the balcony outside our bedroom, the cold air biting my skin, the city lights burning faintly in the distance, and then I heard it. Voices below, near the courtyard. I leaned over the railing and saw Matteo standing in the garden with the scarred lieutenant. They spoke in low tones, but I caught fragments. Betrayal, punishment, loyalty. The lieutenant hesitated, said something about the girl, and I saw Matteo's head snap up, his tone suddenly sharp. "She stays out of it," he said, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. "Touch her, and I'll bury you myself." Something deep inside me twisted. Fear, yes, but also something else. Something fierce and fragile that I didn't want to name. Because in that single moment I realized that beneath the ice, beneath the armor and the blood and the ghosts of the woman he had lost, there was something still alive in Matteo Romano. Something that could burn the world down if it ever learned to love again. And God help me. I wanted to be the one to make it happen. It's strange how quickly fear becomes familiarity. How a heart that once beat in panic can begin to match the rhythm of danger until it feels almost like music. In the days after that night in the basement, after I saw the ruthless man beneath Matteo's perfect exterior, something inside me began to shift. Not out of acceptance, but out of a kind of reluctant understanding. I had stepped through the mirror, and there was no way back to the girl I had been before. The mansion became my universe. Endless corridors, shuttered rooms, the faint echo of footsteps I couldn't always identify. The hum of security cameras hidden in corners, watching even when I pretended not to notice. I learned the schedule of his world without ever being told. The morning meetings that stretched into silence. The coded phone calls that came in the dead of night. The way Matteo's moods could alter the entire temperature of the house. Some days he was calm, precise, focused. A man made entirely of purpose and control. Other days, he was a storm contained in a human body. His eyes shadowed, his voice clipped, his movements sharp enough to draw blood if you got too close. But he never raised his voice to me. Never once. Instead, he built walls out of politeness and boundaries, always careful, always distant, as though affection were a weapon more dangerous than any gun he owned. And yet, every now and then, the mask slipped. Just for a heartbeat. Just enough to let me glimpse the man buried beneath the legend. It happened one afternoon in the library, the same room where I'd once found the photograph of the woman whose ghost still haunted him. I was sitting near the window, sunlight spilling over the page of a book I wasn't really reading, when I heard him enter. His presence filled the space before he even spoke, that quiet gravity that made the air change texture. "I didn't think you liked to read," he said, his voice softer than I expected. I looked up, surprised. "You think I don't have time for books because I'm your wife or because I'm a DeLuca?" A faint curve touched his lips. Not a smile exactly, but something close. "Because most people who marry into this life don't look for stories anymore," he said. "They're too busy surviving their own." The words caught me off guard, more honest than anything he'd ever said to me. "And you?" I asked quietly. "Do you read to escape your story or to rewrite it?" He hesitated, his eyes flicking to the shelves, to the old books lined like soldiers waiting for orders. "Neither," he said at last. "I read to remember what it feels like to be someone else." That answer haunted me for the rest of the day, because beneath the hardness of his tone, I heard it. The ache of a man who'd lost the right to be human. Over the next few days, something like a fragile truce formed between us. We shared meals without silence heavy enough to choke on. He asked questions, simple ones, about my childhood, my mother's garden, the piano I'd once played. And though he didn't offer much about himself, his listening felt real. I found myself watching him in moments when he thought I wasn't. The way his eyes softened when he looked at the sky. The way he paused before answering. as if testing whether truth was still safe to speak. It was during one of those evenings, when the world outside was tinted with dusk and rain slid down the glass like melted pearls, that I saw the ghost of his grief for the first time. He was in his study, door slightly open, unaware that I was passing by. I stopped when I heard his voice, low, broken, a tone I'd never heard from him before. "I'm sorry," he said, barely a whisper. "I tried." My breath caught. Through the crack in the door, I saw him standing before that same photograph. The woman, Alessia. His shoulders rigid, his hand clenched around a glass of whiskey. For a long time, he didn't move, just stared at her face as though he could will her back to life. It felt wrong to watch, wrong to listen, but I couldn't turn away. It was the first time I'd seen Matteo Romano without the armor. When he finally noticed me, he didn't startle, didn't shout. He just turned, eyes red-rimmed, expression unreadable, and said, "You shouldn't be here." "I know," I whispered, stepping inside anyway. "But you shouldn't be alone." He exhaled, long and tired, setting the glass down on the desk. "You don't understand what being near me costs, Isabella. Everyone I let close ends up bleeding for it." "Maybe," I said, my voice trembling. "But I'm already bleeding, Matteo. Just differently." For a moment, we just looked at each other. Two strangers tied together by duty, by grief, by something dangerously close to desire. The distance between us was electric, unbearable, the kind of silence that could turn into anything. A kiss, a confession, a war. Then he turned away, his voice barely a murmur. "Go to bed, Isabella." I obeyed, but I couldn't sleep. His words echoed through the night, tangled with the image of his eyes that carried too much death to ever be free, and yet still flickered with something alive when they looked at me. The next morning, he was gone before dawn. The house felt emptier than usual, and a low unease gnawed at me, though I couldn't say why. I wandered through the hallways until I found one of his guards outside the study, his expression stiff. "Where is he?" I asked. "Downtown," the guard said after a pause. "Meeting with the Caruso men." The Carusos, the same family that had tried to kill us on our wedding day. My chest tightened. All day I waited. The sky darkened, rain turned to thunder, and still he didn't come back. I told myself I wasn't worried, that I was just restless. But when midnight came and his car finally pulled into the courtyard, I was already standing by the window like a fool. He walked in soaked, blood on his sleeve, his expression like granite. I ran to him before I could think. "You're hurt." "It's nothing," he said, voice hoarse, but when he moved I saw the crimson bloom spreading down his side. Without asking, I took his hand and led him to the couch. "Sit," I ordered, surprising even myself. He tried to protest, but I'd already fetched the first aid kit. The next few minutes passed in quiet focus. The sound of rain outside, the scent of whiskey and iron, the tremor of his breath as I cleaned the wound. His body was tense beneath my touch, but he didn't stop me. When I finished, he looked at me with something almost like disbelief. "Why are you doing this?" he asked softly. "Because you won't let anyone else," I said. "Because someone has to." He studied me for a long moment, eyes dark and unreadable, and then, for the first time, his hand brushed against mine, a fleeting, unguarded touch that felt more dangerous than any weapon. "Don't care for me, Isabella," he said, voice low, almost broken. "It won't end the way you think." I wanted to tell him it was already too late, that somewhere between fear and fascination I'd already begun to fall. But I didn't. I only nodded, my throat too tight for words. He left the room soon after, but the warmth of his touch lingered like fire under my skin. That night, as I lay awake listening to the storm fade into silence, I understood the truth that terrified me most of all. Matteo Romano wasn't just a man I'd married to survive. He was a mirror, reflecting the darkness I hadn't known I carried, the hunger for danger, the need to be seen by someone who could destroy me. And if I wasn't careful, that mirror would shatter and take both of us with it. There are moments when the air itself changes before disaster, when something unseen shifts beneath the surface, like the quiet pull of the tide before it breaks. And in the days that followed that night, the night I cleaned the blood from Matteo's skin, and he let me touch the pieces of himself he swore no one could reach, I began to feel that tremor everywhere, in the halls of the mansion, in the tremble of my own heartbeat, in the way the world seemed to hold its breath whenever he entered a room. He tried to keep distance after that, as though by retreating into his fortress of silence he could undo what had already been set in motion. But I could feel the invisible thread that had been tied between us. Fragile, burning, inevitable. And no matter how far he stood, that thread pulled, drawing us towards something neither of us could stop. The mansion had become my prison and my shelter all at once. The days blurred together, the hum of voices outside my door, the rustle of paper, the low rumble of engines as his men came and went. All of it part of a rhythm I'd come to recognize, one that always centered around him. Even when he was gone, Matteo's presence filled every room, every inch of air, as though the house itself was an extension of his will. And then one night, the rhythm broke. It was late, long past midnight, when I heard raised voices outside the main gate. The deep growl of engines, the sharp edge of orders barked into the rain. I went to the window and saw the glow of headlights through the iron bars. Too many cars, too many shadows moving too quickly. Something was wrong. I reached for my phone, my hands trembling. But before I could dial anyone, the door burst open and one of Matteo's guards rushed in, eyes wide with panic. "Mrs. Romano, we have to move," he said. "What's happening?" He didn't answer. He grabbed my arm and pulled me toward the stairs, but before we reached the hall, the lights went out, the sudden darkness cutting through the mansion like a blade. My heart pounded in my throat. Gunfire erupted outside, sharp and echoing, the sound so close it made the walls shudder. "Move!" the guard shouted, but then he fell. A burst of sound, a flash, and he was gone, blood spreading across the marble like spilled ink. I froze, staring, until rough hands caught me from behind, a cloth pressed against my mouth, the sting of chemicals burning my lungs. Everything spun, the world tilted. When I woke, the air was cold and wet, smelling of rust and gasoline. My wrists were bound, my head pounding. I was in a warehouse. I could hear the ocean somewhere nearby, the crash of waves against concrete. The sound of footsteps echoed, and a voice, smooth and mocking, slid through the dark. "So this is the great Matteo Romano's wife," it said. I expected more. I looked up. The man standing before me was tall, lean, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. I recognized him from whispers. Enzo Caruso, Matteo's rival, the man whose name Matteo spoke only when followed by a promise of death. "If you're smart," Enzo said, circling me, "you'll tell me where your husband keeps his ledgers. I know he trusts you more than he lets on." I laughed, though my voice shook. "You think Matteo tells me anything?" He crouched in front of me, his face close enough that I could smell the bitterness of his breath. "No," he said softly, "but he will come for you. And when he does, I'll kill him in front of you." For a moment, fear swallowed me whole. But beneath it, something else flickered. Faith, wild and irrational. Because if there was one thing I knew about Matteo Romano, it was that he didn't lose what was his. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. I couldn't tell anymore. My body ached, my vision blurred, but when I heard the sound, engines outside, shouts, the crash of metal, I knew he had come. The door exploded inward, splinters flying, the room filled with chaos, gunfire, shouting, smoke, I saw him through it all, the shape of him like a shadow carved from vengeance, his movements sharp and precise, death in every motion. "Isabella!" I tried to call his name, but my voice broke. One of Enzo's men grabbed me, pressing a knife against my throat. Matteo froze, his gun raised, eyes locked on mine. "Drop it, Romano," Enzo called from behind a pillar. "Or she dies." Matteo's jaw tightened. For the first time I saw something raw in his eyes. Not rage, but fear. Real human fear. "Let her go," he said, his voice low, shaking in a way I'd never heard before. "This isn't her fight." "Oh, but it is," Enzo sneered. "You made her part of it the moment you married her." And then, everything happened at once. A gunshot, the sear of pain across my arm, Matteo's roar as he lunged forward. I don't remember falling, only the weight of his body over mine, the sound of his heart beating against my ear as he shielded me from the chaos. When the smoke cleared, Enzo was gone, his men scattered, and Matteo's hands were on my face, rough and shaking. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, his voice breaking. "It's nothing," I whispered, though blood streaked my sleeve. He stared at me for a long, unbearable moment, then pulled me into his arms. His body trembled against mine. The man who never flinched, never wavered, now holding me as if he might come apart if he let go. "Don't you ever do that again," he whispered against my hair. "Don't you ever get taken from me again." When he kissed me, it wasn't gentle or planned. It was fire and fury and fear, all the things he'd spent years burying breaking free at once. His mouth was rough, desperate, claiming. And when I kissed him back, I tasted everything he'd been trying to deny. Grief, hunger, the unbearable need to feel alive. When we finally pulled apart, his forehead rested against mine, his breath ragged. "You shouldn't make me feel this," he said. "You don't understand what it does to me." "Then tell me," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Tell me what it does." He closed his eyes, his hand still tangled in my hair. "It makes me weak," he said. "And I can't afford weakness, Isabella. Not in this world." But the lie was in his voice, because weakness had already come. Not in the way he meant, but in the way his body curved around mine as if I were the only thing holding him together. In the way his eyes searched my face as though he was memorizing it, afraid it might vanish. When he finally stood, his mask had returned, though a crack still showed in the steel. "We're leaving," he said, his tone sharp again. "Now." He led me out into the dawn, the sky bruised in gold, the ocean raging below. I followed, blood dried on my skin, my heart still trembling from everything that had just happened. And though I didn't speak, I knew something irreversible had shifted. Because Matteo Romano, the man who swore he couldn't love, who built his empire on control and silence, had just burned the world to get me back. And I knew that from this moment on, no matter what he said, no matter how hard he tried to deny it, something inside him was already mine. What I didn't know then was that love in his world wasn't salvation. It was the fuse that would light everything on fire. It's strange how quickly everything can begin to unravel, how a single decision made in the name of safety can feel like a betrayal when it comes from the person whose touch still burns on your skin. And in the days that followed that night, the night he told me I was leaving, the night his mouth had tasted like confession and danger, I moved through the house like a ghost waiting for its own exile, suspended somewhere between fury and heartbreak, between the ache of wanting him and the dread of being sent away from him. Matteo avoided me for 2 days after that, which was his version of punishment. Not for anything I had done, but for the things he felt when he looked at me. Feelings he couldn't cage, couldn't name, couldn't forgive himself for. I saw him once, across the hall, his voice low as he spoke to one of his men, his suit immaculate, his expression perfectly calm. But when his gaze flicked to me, just for a heartbeat, I caught it. The storm that still lived behind his eyes, the one he kept trying to smother. It was almost enough to make me forget the anger. Almost. By the third morning, the bags were packed. They stood by the door like an accusation. The driver waited, outside. I was supposed to leave before dawn, while the city was still gray and quiet. But Matteo hadn't said goodbye, hadn't even come to tell me himself. He had sent a message instead, delivered through one of his guards, formal, cold, as if the last few nights had been a fever dream neither of us was allowed to remember. That, more than anything, hurt. So I did what I wasn't supposed to do. What he would never expect me to do. I went to find him. The door to his study was closed, but I didn't knock. When I pushed it open, he was at his desk. Papers scattered in front of him, a cigarette burning slowly in the ashtray. He didn't look surprised to see me, only weary, as though he had been waiting for the inevitable storm I was about to bring. "You're not supposed to be here," he said, his voice even, his tone more tired than angry. "I could say the same thing," I said, stepping inside. "You weren't supposed to be in my life either, and yet here we are." He leaned back in his chair, exhaled smoke that curled lazily toward the ceiling. "Isabella?" "No," I interrupted, crossing my arms to keep them from shaking. "Don't do that. Don't use my name like it's a warning. You told me I was leaving, and you didn't even have the courage to say it to my face." He stood slowly, his height swallowing the space between us. But I didn't step back. "You think this is easy for me?" he asked, his voice lower now, rougher. "You think I want to send you away?" "Then why are you doing it?" I demanded. "Why are you pretending this is about my safety when we both know it's because you're afraid?" His expression hardened, but I saw the flicker of truth in it. "You don't understand what's coming," he said. "The Carusos aren't finished, and neither are the others. They'll use you to get to me. They already tried once. If you stay here, they'll try again." "Then let them," I said before I could stop myself. "Let them come. I'm not afraid." "You should be," he snapped, and for the first time his voice broke. "You don't know what they're capable of." "And you think I don't know what you are?" I said. "You think I don't understand who I married? You kill for control, Matteo. You destroy anything that threatens you. You could protect me if you wanted to. But instead, you're sending me away because you can't control what you feel when I'm near you." He froze, the silence between us crackling like static. His jaw flexed, his hands curling into fists at his sides. "You think this is about feelings?" he said, his tone low, dangerous. "You think this is about love?" "Yes," I said, and the word fell from my mouth before I even realized I'd spoken it. "Because no matter how hard you try to deny it, that's exactly what this is." For a long time, neither of us moved. The air between us was thick enough to drown in. And then, just like before, something inside him cracked. He crossed the room in 2 strides, his hand finding my face, his touch trembling with restraint and fury and need. His mouth found mine again. And this time, there was no hesitation. No pretense of control. It was brutal and beautiful. A collision of everything we had tried to hide. Every lie we had told ourselves about what this was. When he finally pulled away, his breath was uneven, his eyes dark and glassy. "You don't know what you're doing," he said, his voice hoarse. "You think love is enough to survive this world. It isn't." "Maybe not," I whispered, "but it's enough to survive you." Something flickered in his gaze, pain, anger, longing. But before he could answer, a knock sounded at the door. He turned sharply, his expression hardening. One of his men stepped inside, face grim. "Boss, we have a problem." Matteo straightened. "What kind of problem?" "The Carusos," the man said. "They're moving tonight. We think someone inside gave them the drop location." "Inside?" Matteo repeated, his tone flat. "Who?" The man hesitated, his eyes flicking briefly to me before he looked away. "We're not sure yet." Matteo's expression didn't change, but the air in the room shifted, growing colder. He dismissed the man with a wave of his hand, then turned back to me slowly. "What did you do?" he asked. The words hit me like ice. "What?" "You've been asking questions," he said. "You've been talking to people you shouldn't talk to. Did you tell anyone where I was sending you?" "No," I said, stepping toward him. "I would never—" But he wasn't listening. The mask was back. The same cold, unreadable face that terrified me the first night we met. "Get out," he said quietly. "Matteo—" "Go upstairs," he said, louder this time. "Now." I felt the world tilt, my throat tightening. "You think I betrayed you?" He didn't answer, and that silence was worse than any accusation. "After everything?" I whispered. "After what we've been through, you think I'd ever—" "I don't know what to think," he said finally, his voice low, almost trembling. "That's the problem." I stared at him. The man who had saved me, kissed me, held me like I was the last thing he'd ever touch. And for the first time, I saw how truly broken he was. A man who trusted no one, not even himself. "You're right," I said softly. "You don't know what to think. You don't know how to love, and you're going to lose the only person who still wants to try." Then I walked out, my vision blurring, my heart pounding like a warning I didn't yet understand. That night I didn't sleep. I waited for him to come after me, to say something, to take it back. But he never did. And when the gunshots shattered the stillness hours later, echoing from the far end of the estate, I understood that the lie between us had just cost us something we could never get back. There are moments in life when time fractures, when the world as you knew it collapses inward, not with the violence of an explosion, but with the terrible stillness that follows it. And the night of the gunfire was one of those moments. The moment when everything I had tried to believe about Matteo, about myself, about what we had built between us, shattered so completely that even breathing felt like a betrayal. The sound came first, sharp, distant, echoing through the marble halls like thunder striking bone. I was in my room, half-dressed, sitting by the window with the curtains open to the dark courtyard, waiting for something I didn't even know how to name. Forgiveness, maybe, or proof that he still trusted me. And then came the second shot, closer this time, followed by the faint scream of tires, the guttural shouting of men, the chaos that always followed Matteo wherever he went. My heart lurched. I ran barefoot into the hallway, my footsteps soft against the cold floor, the walls trembling with the echoes of violence. The guards rushed past me, guns drawn, shouting orders in voices that barely sounded human. I called out for Matteo, but my voice was swallowed by the noise, by the panic, by the smell of smoke that began to drift through the air. And then I saw him. He was at the top of the main staircase, his shirt half undone, his face pale with fury and disbelief. For one terrible second our eyes met, and in that look I saw everything. Accusation, fear, heartbreak. Before he turned away, barking orders to his men. "What's happening?" I cried, but he didn't answer, didn't even glance back at me. He was already moving, already descending into the storm below, already retreating behind the invisible wall he built whenever the world demanded his darkness. I followed him down the stairs, against every instinct, against the shouts of the guards telling me to stay back, because I needed to see. I needed to understand what was happening. And the truth, whatever it was, had already taken root in my chest like a splinter that wouldn't let go. The front doors were wide open, the rain pouring in, the night alive with chaos. One of Matteo's cars was burning near the gate, the flames painting the sky in violent orange light. Men were shouting, dragging bodies, firing into the shadows where the Carusos had made their move. I had seen death before, but not like this, not with my heart bound to the man commanding it. Matteo turned when he saw me, his eyes wild, his voice cutting through the noise. "Get inside." But I couldn't. "What's going on?" I demanded. "Tell me what happened." He strode toward me, grabbed my wrist hard enough to hurt. "I said get inside." "Not until you tell me the truth." His grip tightened, his jaw clenched, and for the first time I saw it. Not just anger, but betrayal, the kind that hollowed out even the strongest men. "The truth?" he said, his voice low, shaking. "The truth is that someone told them where to find us. Someone gave them access to my men, to my roots, to my house." I felt the blood drain from my face. "You think it was me?" He didn't answer, but the silence was worse than any accusation. I pulled back from him, my heart hammering. "You can't possibly believe that." "I don't know what to believe," he said, and the way he looked at me, as if I were a stranger wearing someone else's face, broke something inside me. "Matteo, I would never—" But he turned away, shouting to his men, his commands clipped and ruthless. "Lock the house down. No one leaves, no one enters, not until I find who did this." I stood there in the rain, numb, watching as he disappeared into the smoke, and for the first time since I had met him, I understood what it meant to be on the wrong side of his suspicion. They took me upstairs not long after. 2 of his guards, silent, unyielding. I tried to speak, to explain, to demand they let me see him, but they didn't respond. They led me to one of the smaller rooms at the far end of the east wing, the door heavy, the walls lined with books and old furniture. And when they locked it behind me, I realized what he had done. He had imprisoned me in my own house. At first, I thought it was a mistake, that once he calmed down, he would come to me, that he would see reason. But the hours passed, and the silence grew heavier, and I began to understand that this wasn't anger. It was fear, the kind that only love can cause. Because he did care, I knew he did, and that was what made it worse. His love was never gentle, never kind. It was violent, possessive, the kind that punished even as it protected. When the door finally opened hours later, I thought it was him. My heart leapt, foolish and wild, but it was one of his men instead, tall and expressionless, carrying a tray of food. "Where is he?" I asked. "He's working," the man said. "Working?" I laughed, though it came out broken. "You mean hunting. You mean destroying whoever he thinks betrayed him, even if it's me." The man didn't answer, and when I reached for him, he stepped back, closing the door again with a click that sounded like finality. The hours blurred. I paced the room, tried to think, tried to breathe, but the walls felt like they were closing in. Every noise outside made me flinch. The echo of footsteps, the distant hum of voices, the occasional gunshot that reminded me that out there, Matteo was waging a war built on lies, and that one of those lies had my name written across it. By dawn, I couldn't stand it anymore. I pressed my ear to the door, and that was when I heard it. Voices, low and urgent, just beyond the hall. "She doesn't know anything," one of the men said. "We should tell him before he does something he can't take back." "He won't listen," the other replied. "He thinks with his heart when it comes to her, and that's what makes it worse. She's the only one who could destroy him without even meaning to." I stepped back, my chest tight, the truth cutting deeper than their words. I didn't know what was worse, that he thought I could betray him, or that I had already betrayed myself by loving him anyway. When the door finally opened again, this time it was Matteo. He stood there, his face unreadable, his eyes rimmed with exhaustion, his shirt still stained from the night before. He looked at me for a long moment before he spoke. "It's over," he said quietly. "What does that mean?" "They're dead," he said. "All of them." I swallowed hard, afraid to ask what he'd done, afraid of how easily his voice carried both confession and justification. "And me?" I whispered. His gaze hardened. "You stay here, until I decide what to do with you." The words hit harder than any slap. "Decide what to do with me?" He stepped closer, and I could see it. The conflict beneath his fury, the war between the man who wanted to believe in me and the man who couldn't afford to. "If you lied to me," he said softly, "if you gave them anything, even without knowing, I need to know." "And if I didn't?" He didn't answer. That silence was enough. I felt something in me collapse, the last fragile thread of trust that had kept me tethered to him. I took a step back, my voice shaking. "You think you can control everything, Matteo. You think love means ownership. But what you don't understand is that the moment you stopped trusting me, you lost me." He looked at me then, truly looked, and for a second I saw it. Regret, pain, the ghost of the man who had once told me love was weakness. And then, like always, the mask returned. "Then maybe I already have," he said, and walked away, the door closing behind him like the end of a prayer. That night, I sat in the darkness, listening to the rain against the windows, knowing that whatever came next would not just test our love. It would destroy what little of ourselves we had left to give. Time doesn't heal in the way people claim it does. It doesn't stitch the wound closed or erase the memory of pain. It simply teaches you how to walk around the scar without tracing it with your fingers every hour of every day. And that is what the last 3 months had been for me. A cruel kind of endurance. A long, slow lesson in pretending that I no longer bled. The villa in Palermo was beautiful in that detached, melancholy way of places built for solitude. The sea spread endlessly beyond the cliff, blue and merciless, the waves crashing against the rocks like a warning that even paradise could drown you if you lingered too close. Matteo had sent me there after the night of the betrayal, and though his men still lingered at a distance, always watching, always silent, I lived as if I were the only person in the world. I told myself I hated him for it. I told myself I would never forgive him for locking me away like a prisoner, for believing I could ever have betrayed him, for looking at me like love was something poisonous that had already begun to rot. But hate, I learned, is only love left too long in the dark. It doesn't fade, it ferments, turning bitter and sharp until it burns your throat to speak his name. And still, even after all this time, I whispered it sometimes, in the quiet hours just before dawn, when the sea outside was a sheet of silver and the air carried that faint scent of salt and loss. Matteo. I wanted to stop missing him. I wanted to stop remembering the way his hand felt on my skin, the low timbre of his voice when he wasn't trying to frighten me, the way his eyes softened when he forgot to guard them. But memory isn't a choice. It's a haunting. I had learned to live in the half-light of that haunting. I woke early, made tea, wandered the halls of the villa barefoot, touching the cold stone walls as though they might hold the warmth of a life that no longer existed. Some mornings I walked to the edge of the cliff and watched the fishing boats below, small and fragile against the vast horizon, and I wondered if he ever thought of me, or if the world he ruled had swallowed even that. It was on one of those mornings that everything changed. The sun had barely risen, painting the sky in pale gold, and the villa was quiet except for the rhythmic sound of waves below. I had been feeling strange for days, lightheaded, restless, as if something in my body was trying to tell me a secret I didn't want to hear. And that morning, the truth came to me in the most ordinary of ways. I was in the kitchen when the cup slipped from my hand, shattering on the floor. The sound echoed through the empty room, sharp and final. I pressed a hand to my stomach without thinking, and in that instant, I knew. I was pregnant. The realization struck with a force I wasn't prepared for. Not joy, not fear, but something larger than both. something that felt like the universe tilting on its axis. I sank to the floor among the shards of porcelain, my fingers trembling as they brushed against the small swell that wasn't visible yet, but that I could suddenly feel as though my heart had moved there to make room for someone else. For a long time, I just sat there, the morning light spilling across the tiles, the waves crashing below, my breath uneven. There was no one to tell, no one to hold me, no one to whisper that it would be all right. Matteo had vanished from my world, but his presence had not. It lived beneath my skin now, beating in rhythm with the life growing inside me. I didn't cry. I thought I might, but there were no tears left in me. There was only the slow, heavy understanding that the man who had ruined and saved me in equal measure would never know what he had left behind. For days after, I tried to make sense of it, pacing the halls, standing at the window, staring out at the endless horizon as if the sea might have an answer. I told myself it didn't matter, that I didn't need him, that this child could be mine alone, free from the shadows that followed Matteo Romano. But each time I whispered that lie, the truth whispered back louder. I still loved him, and love like that never stays buried. The men Matteo had assigned to guard me came and went, polite and distant, never asking questions, never looking too closely. But I saw the way their eyes lingered sometimes, the quiet pity they thought I didn't notice, as though they all knew something I didn't, or feared something they couldn't say. Then one night, the silence broke. It was late, the air thick with the scent of rain, the windows rattling from the wind coming off the sea. I was sitting by the fireplace, half lost in thought, when the sound came, the faint crunch of tires on gravel outside, the low murmur of voices that weren't familiar. My pulse quickened. I stood, moving quietly toward the window. There were lights in the courtyard, not the usual guard vehicles, but dark cars, engines still running, their presence wrong in a way I couldn't explain. Before I could react, the front door burst open, and the night exploded with noise, shouting, footsteps, the crack of gunfire. I froze. The guards were shouting my name, but before I could reach the stairs, one of them fell. A flash of red across the marble, the smell of smoke and metal filling the air. I turned to run, my heart hammering, but strong arms caught me from behind, a rough hand clamping over my mouth. "Don't scream!" a voice hissed. The accent was unfamiliar. Caruso. It had to be. I struggled, kicking, twisting, but the grip was too strong. Panic clawed up my throat as I felt the barrel of a gun press against my ribs. "He'll come for you," the man said, his breath hot against my ear. "You know he will." And in that moment, despite the terror, despite everything he'd done, I knew it was true. Because if Matteo Romano was still alive, there was nothing in this world that would keep him from finding me. The sound of gunfire grew closer. The man holding me cursed, dragging me backward toward the door. I stumbled, the floor slick beneath my feet, the world spinning in flashes of light and shadow. And then, through the chaos, through the smoke, I heard it. His voice. "Isabella!" I turned, and there he was, bloodied, furious, his gun raised, his eyes wild and burning in the half-light. For a second, the world stopped moving. Everything, the fear, the pain, the months of silence, vanished. He was real. He was here. He fired. The man behind me fell. I ran to him, and when his arms closed around me, I felt the universe exhale. He smelled like gunpowder and rain, like everything I had tried to forget. And when he spoke, his voice was raw, broken, human. "I looked for you everywhere," he whispered. "I thought I'd lost you." I wanted to tell him everything. About the loneliness, about the nights spent waiting, about the heartbeat I carried that belonged to both of us. But all that came out was his name. "Matteo." He held me tighter, his hand trembling against my back. "It's over," he said, though I knew it wasn't. Not really. Not yet. You're safe now. And maybe it was the adrenaline, or the exhaustion, or the fragile thread of hope I still clung to. But when I looked up at him, at the man who had once promised he couldn't love me, I saw something in his eyes I had never seen before. Love. Real, unguarded, desperate love. And that was when I knew. The story between us wasn't ending. It was just beginning again. And this time, neither of us would survive it unchanged. There is a silence that comes after the gunfire. A silence so deep it feels alive. Breathing. Waiting. And it was in that silence that I realized nothing would ever be the same again. The villa smelled of smoke and blood and rain, and as Matteo's men dragged the bodies of the intruders away, I stood in the middle of the chaos, trembling, my dress torn, my hands streaked with crimson that wasn't mine but felt like it might as well have been. He hadn't let go of me since he found me, his hand wrapped around mine like a vow he didn't yet know how to speak. His eyes moved constantly, scanning every shadow, every doorway, the predator in him restless even after the fight had ended. But when he looked at me, really looked at me, I saw something raw and unguarded that hadn't been there before, something that scared me more than the violence ever could. Love, when it came to men like Matteo Romano, was a battlefield all its own. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice hoarse, his fingers brushing my cheek as if he couldn't quite believe I was real. "I'm fine," I said, though my body ached with the bruises of his world, though fear still pulsed beneath my skin like static. "But you shouldn't have come. You shouldn't have found me." His jaw tightened. "Did you really think I wouldn't? You shouldn't have risked everything." He stepped closer, his eyes dark and fierce, his voice a low growl. "You are everything." The words cut through me like glass, beautiful and terrible all at once. I wanted to believe them, but belief was dangerous. Belief was what got people killed in Matteo's world. He turned away then, running a hand through his hair, his breath uneven. "They were supposed to be gone," he said quietly. "The Carusos. I made sure of it." "Then how did they find me?" I asked, though I already knew the answer, or at least the shape of it. Betrayal, the constant shadow behind every truth he touched. He didn't answer. He didn't have to. The silence said enough. By morning, the villa was half destroyed, the air thick with the acrid sting of gunpowder and grief. Matteo stood in the courtyard, giving orders, his voice clipped and calm, but I could see the exhaustion pulling at him, the faint tremor in his hands when he thought no one was watching. I wanted to go to him, to tell him it was over, that we could leave it all behind. But even then, I knew that men like him didn't leave anything behind. They just kept fighting until there was nothing left to save. When he came inside hours later, his shirt stained, his eyes hollow, I met him in the doorway. "You can't keep doing this," I said softly. "You can't keep killing pieces of yourself and calling it survival." He stared at me for a long time, then said, "You don't understand, Isabella. This isn't about survival anymore, it's about ending it." "Ending what?" "All of it," he said. "The empire, the blood, the debts, I'm done." I didn't believe him, not at first. Matteo Romano didn't know how to stop. He only knew how to burn. But as I looked at him then, I saw the truth written in the lines of his face. He was tired. Not of me, not of the violence, but of himself. "What are you going to do?" I asked. "Walk away," he said simply. "Take what's left of my men, destroy what can't be saved, and disappear." "And me?" He hesitated. "You come with me, if you still want to." The air caught in my chest, fragile and trembling. "If I still want to?" He moved closer, his hand lifting to touch my face, his voice low and rough. "You have every reason to hate me. I hurt you, I doubted you, I caged you. I let fear decide for me, but if there's still a part of you that believes I can be something better, something other than what I've been, then come with me. I wanted to tell him yes. God, I wanted to. But before I could answer, something shifted inside me. A sharp twist of nausea, sudden and fierce. I staggered, my hand flying to my stomach, my breath catching in my throat. "Isabella," he said, his tone instantly sharp. "What is it?" I shook my head, trying to steady myself, but the room tilted, and before I could stop it, the truth slipped free. "I'm pregnant." The silence that followed was absolute. For a moment, he just stared at me, as if the words didn't make sense, as if he'd misheard them. Then his breath left him all at once, a sound that was neither shock nor joy but something deeper, heavier. "Say that again." "I'm pregnant," I said, my voice trembling now. "It's yours." He took a step toward me, then another, his face unreadable. "How long have you known?" "A few weeks," I said. "I didn't tell you because I didn't know if you'd want to know." His hand brushed his mouth, his eyes flicking to mine and then away. "Of course I wanted to know," he said, his voice rough, almost breaking. "I just never thought I'd get to." I didn't understand what he meant until I saw the look in his eyes. The mixture of wonder and despair, of hope and fear, all colliding at once. He reached for me then, his hand trembling as it rested against my stomach. "You're carrying my child," he whispered, almost reverently. "Do you have any idea what that means?" "It means we don't have the luxury of dying anymore," I said softly. He smiled, a small, broken thing. "No," he said. "It means I have something left to lose." For a moment the world felt still, suspended between ruin and rebirth. I saw the man he could have been, the man he might still become, and I thought, foolishly, that maybe love was enough after all. But peace never lasts in Matteo's world. That evening, just as the sun began to fall into the sea, one of his men came running up the path, his face pale, his voice shaking. "Boss," he said, breathless, "it's not over. The Carusos, they're not dead. They regrouped. They're coming here." Matteo froze, his hand tightening around mine. "How long?" "An hour, maybe less." He turned to me, his expression hardening, the softness gone, replaced by the sharp, deadly focus I remembered from the man I first met. "You need to go," he said. "Now. I'm not leaving you." "Yes, you are," he said firmly. "You go to the docks, you get on the boat. I'll meet you there when it's done." "Matteo." "Please," he said, his voice breaking. "Don't fight me on this." And for the first time, I realized he wasn't giving me an order. He was begging. He kissed me once, hard and fast, the kind of kiss that tasted like goodbye. And then he was gone, barking orders, gathering weapons, preparing for a war he didn't intend to survive. I stood there, my body trembling, one hand resting protectively over my stomach. And I knew that I couldn't lose him. Not now. Not when I'd just begun to believe in him again. So I didn't go to the docks. I followed him instead, through the burning corridors of the villa, down into the courtyard where his men were preparing for the fight that would decide everything. He saw me, his expression a mixture of fury and fear. "Isabella." "I'm not leaving you," I said again. "Not this time." The sound of engines filled the night. Headlights cut through the darkness. Matteo turned toward the gate, his gun already raised, his body taut with readiness. "Stay behind me," he said. And then the first bullet hit him. It was almost silent, just a sharp crack in the air, a whisper of metal through flesh, and then he was on the ground, his blood spreading across the stone, and the world, my world, shattered. I screamed his name, dropped to my knees beside him, my hands pressing against the wound, my tears mixing with the blood. His eyes fluttered open, his voice barely a breath. "Isabella," he whispered, "don't cry." But I was already breaking. "Stay with me," I begged. Please stay with me. He smiled faintly, his hand finding mine. Now you know, he said softly, the words trembling like the last flicker of a dying flame. Now you know what it means to love me. And as the night exploded into chaos once more, I felt his hand go still in mine, and the world stopped breathing. There are moments when the world stops moving, when the noise of everything, the shouting, the gunfire, the chaos, fades into a single, unbearable sound. The silence of someone you love slipping away from you. That was how it felt as I knelt beside Matteo, the rain falling in soft, relentless sheets, the air thick with smoke and grief, my hands slick with his blood as if I could keep him tethered to the earth by refusing to let him go. His eyes were half open, unfocused, gray like the sky above us, and for a heartbeat I thought he was already gone. But then his fingers twitched, finding mine, a ghost of a smile crossing his lips, as if even dying, he still needed to touch me. I remember whispering his name again and again, as if saying it enough times could bring him back from the edge. Matteo, 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 until the syllables lost meaning and became a prayer. He didn't answer, not really, but he breathed, shallow and ragged, the sound torn and fragile. You need to go, he managed, his voice barely audible, the words dragged through the weight of pain. I'm not leaving you, I said, though the lie trembled on my tongue because I could already see the fear in his men's eyes, the way they looked at him like they were watching a legend collapse. You're going to be fine. Do you hear me? You always survive. He tried to smile again, but it was a broken thing. Not this time, he whispered. No, I said, pressing harder against the wound, feeling the warmth of his blood against my skin. You don't get to do this. You don't get to leave me now. His gaze met mine, clear, soft, achingly human, and in that look, I saw everything that had always been hidden beneath his armor. Fear, love, regret, tenderness, the pieces of him that the world had never been allowed to touch. You saved me, he said. I shook my head, tears blurring everything. No, I didn't. He exhaled, slow and uneven, his voice just a breath now. Yes, you did. You made me remember what it felt like to be human. And then his eyes closed, and for one terrible, eternal moment I thought that was it. That the story was over. That the man I had fought and hated and loved was gone. But Matteo Romano was too stubborn to die quickly. They carried him inside while the last of the gunfire faded into the distance. The villa was in ruins, walls scorched, windows shattered, the scent of smoke heavy in the air. But somehow it still stood, like the man himself, broken yet unyielding. His men worked in silence, their loyalty written in every movement, their faces drawn with grief they couldn't show. The doctor came at dawn. I sat by the bed while he worked, my hands shaking, my heart refusing to believe what my eyes already knew. Matteo was unconscious, pale, motionless except for the faint rise and fall of his chest, each breath a fragile thread connecting him to me. I didn't move for hours. I just watched him, memorizing the lines of his face, tracing the shadow of stubble along his jaw, the faint scar near his temple, the quiet strength even in stillness. I whispered everything I had never said. The apologies, the confessions, the promises, knowing he couldn't hear me but needing to speak them anyway. It was only when the doctor finally turned to me that I realized I was still holding Matteo's hand. He's alive, the doctor said softly, but barely. The bullet missed his heart by inches. He needs rest, time, and luck. Then he'll live, I said, as if saying it could make it true. The days that followed blurred into one long stretch of waiting. The men rebuilt what they could, the sound of hammers and footsteps filling the silence Matteo had left behind. I slept in a chair beside him, waking at every shift of his breathing, terrified that the next would never come. It was on the 5th morning when it happened. A small sound, a sigh, followed by the faint flutter of his eyelids. I sat up so fast the room spun. His gaze found mine, hazy and unfocused at first, then steady. "You're still here," he whispered, his voice rough, barely more than a rasp. "I told you," I said, tears flooding my eyes before I could stop them. "I'm not leaving you." He smiled, faint, weak, but real. And for the first time in what felt like forever, something inside me loosened, a knot untying itself in the quiet dawn light. He slept again soon after, but I didn't feel the same fear anymore. Something had changed in him, or maybe in me. The man who had lived his whole life fighting the world had finally let someone fight for him. Weeks passed. His strength returned slowly, and when he could finally walk again, he stood on the terrace overlooking the sea, the wind tangling through his hair, the sunrise painting him in gold. I joined him there every morning, the child growing quietly inside me, a secret still unspoken between us, but felt in every glance. One morning, as the sky burned pink over the horizon, he took my hand in his touch warm and steady. "I destroyed everything that made me who I was," he said, his voice soft but certain. "And I thought that meant I had nothing left to give you. But I was wrong." I looked at him, the man who had once been all sharp edges and control, now softer, scarred, human. "What does that mean?" I asked. "It means I'm done running," he said. "I'm done with the empire, the violence, the ghosts. I want something else now. Something real. Something I never thought I deserved." "And what is that?" He turned to me then, his eyes clearer than I'd ever seen them, his hand resting gently on the curve of my stomach. "You. Us. This." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The world felt impossibly quiet, as if it too was holding its breath. And then I leaned into him, resting my head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart, the same heart that had once been too cold to love and now held the rhythm of 2 lives. We left Palermo a month later, quietly, without fanfare. The Romano name still echoed through the streets like a ghost story, but the man behind it had vanished, replaced by someone the world would never recognize. We found a small villa on the coast, hidden between the cliffs and the olive trees, where no one asked questions and the sea sang us to sleep each night. He spent his days repairing the house, his hands no longer made for holding guns but for mending wood, for touching me, for building something that might finally last. And as the days grew longer, and my body changed with the slow miracle of new life, I began to believe that maybe, just maybe, love had been the point of it all. The fire that destroyed him, and the same fire that rebuilt him. Sometimes, when the evening light turned the sea to silver, he would sit beside me and press a kiss to my temple, murmuring, "You were the only thing I couldn't control, and the only thing I never wanted to." And I would smile, because he was wrong. I had never been the thing he couldn't control. Love was. Love had undone him. Love had rebuilt him. Love had saved him in all the ways he refused to be saved. Now, when I look back, at the blood, the violence, the nights filled with fear and desire and fury, I see it differently. Not as a tragedy, but as a transformation. Because I married a man who couldn't love. And somewhere between the pain and the ruin, he learned how. He still dreams sometimes, dark, restless dreams that wake him in the middle of the night. And when he does, I hold him until he finds his breath again. And when he looks at me, there's still that flicker of disbelief in his eyes, as though he can't quite believe that he's still here, that I am still here, that we are both still alive. And maybe that's the truth of it. Maybe love isn't about perfect endings or promises that don't break. Maybe love is just the decision to stay, even when everything around you is burning. To hold on to the one hand that still reaches for you through the smoke. Because he couldn't love me once. Not until the world fell apart. Not until death brushed against his skin. Not until everything he built turned to ash. But he does now. And sometimes, when the baby laughs, when the sea wind carries the sound of his voice through the open window, I whisper it to myself. A reminder, a confession, a prayer. He couldn't love me back. Until this happened. And in the end, that was enough.